How did Sparta, a mere city-state with an agrarian economy and barely any economic growth to speak of, rise to become at one point the supreme power in ancient Greece? For thousands of years, the answer to that was obvious. They were the Spartans. They were the fiercest warriors in all the land. They were tougher, better trained, more able to endure hardship, and willing to die rather than surrender. If you ever came face to face with a Spartan phalanx on the battlefield, God help you. That's what we all thought, until a few years ago, when a series of publications began cropping up by a small group of academics and independent writers claiming to debunk the so-called myth of Sparta. As it turned out, everything we thought we knew about the Spartans was a big bronze lie. They were not exceptional warriors after all. In fact, they were losers on the battlefield almost as often as they were winners. Or so these new writers claimed. Longtime listeners of this program will remember that I hosted such a revisionist scholar on the podcast a couple years ago. Go back to episode 54 or click here to revisit that. Now, my sense in looking at the comments to that video and elsewhere on the internet and from communicating with listeners is that this new take on Sparta raises a big and obvious question. If the Spartans weren't as badass on the battlefield as we thought, then how did they become the preeminent power in Greece? And furthermore, how did they maintain that power for the better part of 2 centuries? In other words, what was the Spartan recipe or formula for dominance? That's what we're going to discuss today. Hi, thanks for tuning in to Ancient Greece Declassified. I'm Lantern Jack, and our guest today is Eric W. Robinson, professor of history at Indiana University and the author of a couple of books on the earliest democracies of ancient Greece. I recently met Eric at a conference in Greece where I discovered that his upcoming book is on Sparta. And he has a fresh new theory as to what the source of Spartan power really was. So I immediately invited him on the pod to talk about it and was luckily able to convince him to come on even though the book isn't out yet. So Eric Robinson, welcome to Ancient Greece Declassified.
Thank you, Jack. Happy to be here.
Thanks for giving our listeners an advanced look at your upcoming book. What is the title going to be?
Spartan Legend.
Okay. Now, I think I need to make a little disclaimer here before we jump into the historical details. Unfortunately, this debate about Sparta is tainted by modern politics a lot more than we would like, being ancient historians. And so it's assumed in some circles that if you're giving a non-critical take of Spartan history, you're some kind of Spartan fanboy or, political activist. So just to clarify, we're not Spartan fanboys. I'm guessing that you, like me, see the Spartans in the way that a zoologist might look at animals, like as just with curiosity to understand a very strange system. Am I right about that?
Yeah, that's fair.
Okay. All right. So if we're trying to understand in a dispassionate way the source of Spartan power, how far back in history should we go to start our investigation?
Well, Sparta becomes the leading power in Greece in the 6th century BC, exactly with the foundation of the Peloponnesian League that it led. Exactly when that happened is not known, but certainly by the late 6th century BC, Sparta is leading the Peloponnesian League and is the most powerful state in Greece.
So at that point, Sparta kind of bursts onto the scene as this leader of many other city-states in Greece. Do you have a sense of how they got there, though? What made them reach that state of power, early power?
It's hard to say. They must have been very successful on the battlefield. We have reports from Herodotus in particular about different victories of the Spartans, but it doesn't provide us with a continuous narrative of the growth of Spartan power and the foundation of the Peloponnesian League. We sort of can piece together that this must have happened in the course of the 6th century. Why were they successful in this way? Well, the ancient authors like to talk about the Spartan constitutional order as the explanation for why the Spartan citizens became the best warriors in Greece. It's hard to know, though. I mean, we can say a couple of things. Advantages the Spartans had. The Spartans were large in terms of population. The Spartan city-state was a very large one, and they came to control during the course of the Archaic period not just Laconia, the immediate geographical area around Sparta, but also Messenia. And so they controlled something like 2/5 of the Peloponnese. It's an area maybe the size of the state of Delaware, something like that. And so they controlled a lot of territory. They had a lot of population, a lot of Spartan population. They enslaved many thousands of Greeks, and they were able to use their labor to build resources. So these are advantages that the Spartans had in the course of the getting them to the point where in the late 6th century, they've used their power to attain leadership over the Peloponnesian League.
So I'm going to push you a little back further in time, okay? Because each step you go back, there's another question. Well, how did they get there? You know, so they were large. How did they become large? And unfortunately, our richest source on this is probably Plutarch, who was writing almost a millennium after the fact, and he claims, or based on his sources, which he had access to libraries that we don't have access to anymore. Based on his sources, many of which were semi-mythical, there was this potentially mythical lawgiver, Lycurgus, who fits the template of the sage. He wanders around as an exile, observes many different systems of government, and then returns to his native territory where he stages a coup, and from his enlightened brain rearranges the new constitution. And by constitution in the ancient world, we mean just a body of laws. There's no like one document that says constitution on top. And according to Plutarch, Lycurgus is the author of all the traditions and systems and training regimens that, as you said, other authors claimed were the secret sauce that made the Spartans the best warriors, the best citizens, etc. How much of that, if anything, do you lend credence to?
Well, don't forget, in your little description, part of Lycurgus's genius comes from the god Apollo at Delphi, the constitutional order that he either created, was blessed by the Delphic Oracle, or according to some accounts, the Delphic Oracle itself provided it. So you've got this sort of divine genealogy added to legendary Lycurgus. How much of it is true? I don't. So you mentioned Plutarch's account of the biography of Lycurgus, and there's a whole bunch of material there, anecdotes about conversations Lycurgus had and personal details of Lycurgus. I don't know if we can believe any of that stuff, but that there was an overhaul of the Spartan constitution relatively early in Greek history, earlier than other Greek city-states we hear about, including, say, the Athenians, and that this new constitutional order played a role in stability in Spartan society in the archaic period of Greek history, which was a pretty volatile period of Greek history. That's quite believable. There's nothing to contradict that in our other sources. I'm a believer that there was a set of reforms. Maybe there was a guy named Lycurgus. Maybe there are a couple Lycurguses. The ancient sources are particularly confused about when Lycurgus was doing any of these things. Modern scholars have settled in maybe the 7th century BC. A few scholars think maybe early 6th century BC for some of the aspects of the Lycurgan reforms. But I to answer your question, I don't doubt that there were a series of revolutionary reforms in Sparta that reorganized their society early in the archaic age. And if we want to assign them to the legendary Lycurgus, that's fine with me. I'm just not going to believe the personal stories associated with him that, for example, we hear in Plutarch.
So then the question is, do you think those revolutionary reforms, whoever may have been the author of them, did they contribute to a society that was able to conquer so much territory in the Peloponnese?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the theories about this is that the early Spartan advantage in hoplite warfare comes not because they were necessarily more skilled or highly trained, but that early reforms to Spartan society meant that a large proportion of the Spartan population was cohesively included in the community and fought together in the hoplite phalanx. And if this happened earlier than other Greek city-states and the Spartans could bring 8,000 soldiers to the battlefield when other city-states were only bringing 1,000 or 2,000 soldiers, this would be a massive advantage. And so setting aside the issue of the training regimen that the Spartans, supposedly undertook, and whether that goes all the way back to the early days of the Lycurgan reforms, and the answer is we just don't know. Maybe not. Just the fact that the reforms settled Spartan society, which according to our sources was in the very early days rather chaotic. There are stories of kings who were murdered, and Sparta was a wreck before the good government eunomia that Lycurgus's order brought. If these reforms simply made Sparta a more cohesive society with a stable government that was inclusive on a larger proportion of its population in its citizen militia, the hoplite army, this would have been, I think, sufficient advantage. You don't necessarily have to ascribe the sort of the harsh training regimen that becomes part of the Spartan story back to the earliest days of the Lycurgan reforms.
Okay, that's fascinating. So some of our listeners will have probably heard of the hoplite revolution theory of the origins of democracy, that this more egalitarian army strategy was one of the impetuses towards democracy. And you're saying that in Sparta, even though Sparta never became a democracy, if it experienced a bit of this trend and had a kind of early start on this, where they created at least a segment of the population to share an equal status and to fight as a unit, that kind of gave them a head start in this process and might have allowed them to grab territory early on. Is that the gist of it?
Yeah, I think that's fair. The other thing to note is that the Spartan constitution, constitutional order, as you said, we're not talking about a written document somewhere, as it's reported to us, actually does have some rather democratic elements. Some scholars have said, well, maybe we should talk about Sparta as the first democracy. I disagree. As the author of multiple books about early democracy, I don't think Sparta counts as an early democracy. But there are definitely democratic elements in the Spartan constitution as it's described. And so, I think it's seeing the Hoplite Revolution, so-called, which we know is going on sort of all over Greece. That is a transition from more elite ways of warfare, the sort of thing that you can find in Homer's Iliad, for example, to transitioning to organized sort of hoplite combat, which involved a larger proportion of the citizen body fighting in the key role in the hoplite phalanx. Yeah, Sparta might have had an early jump, and I don't want to make a direct connection between transition to hoplite warfare and the appearance of democracies in Greece, but it's one of the long-term factors that was probably at play.
Can you give an example of a supposedly democratic feature of the Spartan constitution?
Sure. Well, as it's described in the Great Retra, pieces of which survive in later literature.
What are the Great Retra?
The Great Retra is this agreement, this blueprint for the Spartan constitutional order that supposedly Lycurgus brought back from Delphi. And it outlines the sort of the basic centers of power. It talks about the kings, it talks about the Gerousia, the Council of Elders, and it talks about the people. And there's a line that says, and with the people shall go the power. And that sounds like, from a later democratic point of view, that sounds very much like a democratic constitution. Now, there are aspects of the Spartan constitution that undermine the power of the people. Is an element Plutarch says it was added later to the Great Retra. Some scholars think maybe it was part of the Retra all along. that talks about how the kings and the Agerusia, if they don't like what the people did, they can set the manners aside, which sounds like a veto of the popular will by the elite. So it's one of the reasons why I don't think we can really talk about this having been a democracy. But, if the people are an important element included in the founding words of the Spartan constitutional order, and it says that the people have the power, there's a democratic element for you.
Well, that's so interesting because I remember when I was reading about Solon, I can't remember if it was in Herodotus or in Plutarch, but one of the ancient sources says that when he was, so this is in pre-democratic Athens, there's a debt crisis. Most of the citizens are in serious debt. Some of them are being sold into slavery because of their debt. And Solon is appointed as a kind of temporary dictator, basically, to solve the problem. The source says that Deimos was hoping that he would replicate what Lycurgus did in Sparta and create all the citizens equal. And that was interesting because it shows you that even in a kind of repressive regime like Sparta, there can be a very limited class of citizens that do enjoy a kind of equality amongst themselves. They just kind of hover over a larger population of...
Yeah, and that's another democratic element I could have named. I mean, among the Spartiate full citizens, egalitarianism was an absolute ideal. I mean, land redistribution is one of the things Lycurgus supposedly carried out, where all the land was redivided on a equitable basis among the Spartiate citizens. Now, this excludes the two other groups of people who lived in Sparta's lands that did not get these land distributions, as far as we know, and that would be the Perioikoi, who were not Spartans, but free inhabitants of the land of Laconia, who would fight alongside the Spartans in battle to defend the lands, but were not included in the Spartan constitution. And of course, the Helot slaves, who worked the lands of the Spartans that were being redistributed to the Spartan citizens. But among the Spartiate citizens themselves, there's a strong sense of egalitarianism reported about the earliest Lycurgan reforms. So, yeah, that's another sort of democratic, if you will, element of the Spartan constitutional order.
One of the interesting, even surprising things that one finds when one reads the surviving sources from the classical period, which are almost all Athenian, is just how many Athenian intellectuals admired Sparta, like Thucydides and Plato and Xenophon. They really admired Sparta, even though they were living through a war against Sparta. Any sense of why that is?
That's a good question. I think that part of it has to do with dissatisfaction with the Athenian democracy. Athenian democracy could be very harsh on intellectuals and people who thought that government should be in the hands of the educated elites, not ordinary poor Athenians who flood into the assemblies for meetings or staff the jury panels on which leaders are tried before. I think there's a lot of frustration among Athenian intellectuals for how the Athenian democracy could mistreat its intellectuals. The most famous example, of course, being putting to death Socrates. And so in casting about for other constitutional orders, the Spartan system of government would be a natural comparandum. It's a long-standing, stable constitutional order. It was described by theorists from the classical period and after as sort of a mixed constitutional order, where there were elements of sort of royalty with kings, there were sort of sage elders with the council of the Gerousia, and there were the ordinary people in their assemblies playing a role, but a limited role in the larger constitution. And I think, from a theoretical standpoint, this looks like an attractive sort of constitutional order. And there's also the fact that Sparta had great success. And in antiquity, when Greek theorists would take a look at trying to explain the success of this or that city-state, they would often go to the constitutional order. And so Sparta's military success lent a certain credibility to its political order, and I suspect made it more interesting to Athenian intellectuals.
Before I get to your own theory about Sparta's secret formula, I want to just wrap up this thread about what the ancients thought about constitutions. And you mentioned a few salient points, the stability of the Spartan constitution. So the ancients admired the Spartans for their stability, for having a system that never succumbed to tyranny or to a constitutional upheaval. And as you pointed out, the later writers like Polybius saw Sparta as almost like a proto-Rome, like a system that managed to hybridize to combine the various archetypes of democracy, aristocracy, and monarchy into one system to make it stable. So I just want to pursue that a little bit. First of all, do you agree with this fundamental, almost axiom of ancient political thought that a good body of laws begets good citizens?
Short answer, no. It's far too simplistic. I suspect that modern analysis of state power takes into account demographics and geography and accidents of history like neighboring states and such. And I think it's appropriate. I think that body of laws and constitution can play a role. We've already talked about one place where it may have. The early reforms in the Spartan constitution, the integration of the Spartan population into its hoplite militia force, may have been a real advantage early on. So I'm not saying that constitution played no role, but I just think that it leaves out of the equation a whole bunch of other stuff that we should be paying attention to also.
Okay, let me rephrase the question. If there was a big complex formula to explain all the factors that beget good citizens, is a good constitution one of the major components of that?
That begets good citizens, yes.
So the ancients were not wrong. They were just incomplete in their thinking.
I'd say that's fair.
Okay. All right. And then finally, do you agree with Polybius's assessment that the Spartan system, by being a kind of hybrid system, was perhaps more robust than, say, a pure democracy or a pure aristocracy?
Yeah, I think a mixed constitution or a balanced constitution that integrates sort of different elements of the citizen population is likely to have been more stable. I mean, Aristotle, before Polybius went on about this, Aristotle argued that this was so. And yeah, I think that Polybius is probably right on that. The problem with Polybius's analysis is the whole thing is geared to idealizing the Roman order. And so he picks and chooses his example among the Greeks to sort of buttress his case that it was the perfection of the Roman constitution that explains Rome's success. And Sparta, for him, was an imperfect example of the sort of thing the Romans did. The Romans just did it better.
Okay, and the final point before we get to your perspective, the last and most obvious explanation we find in the sources for Spartan dominance was their military prowess and their invincibility on the battlefield. How much of that do you lend credence to?
A fair amount. The Spartans had great success on the battlefield, particularly if you're talking about major hoplite clashes with multiple city-states, thousands on each side, the sort of big battles that tended to settle wars, not always, but tended to settle wars. The Spartans had a remarkable record of success at this. And so I think to deny that their soldiers fighting in a hoplite phalanx were just often better than the other Greek city-states, I think is not paying attention to the sources. So yeah, there is definitely something to it.
Yeah, I think, okay, when you put it that way, that kind of cuts through one of the common arguments I hear debunking the Spartan myth is that if you plot all of the battles we know about on a chart, they only won like 54%. But that's giving equal weight to every single engagement, when, as you said, the major engagements have a lot more weight than the minor ones. And also, who's to say that 54% isn't enough? I mean, like, what percentage do you need in order to of victories in order to maintain dominance? Hard to say without comparing it to other civilizations, etc.
Right. There were the Spartans were constantly engaged in warfare. So there are lots of little skirmishes where there was a Spartan garrison somewhere and got in a scrap with some, opposing force coming in their territory. I mean, there's all sorts of small little battles, and yeah, the Spartans didn't always win. They weren't close to always winning. But the big major battles, particularly ones, and we'll get to this as we talk about my book more, battles involving allies on either side, coalitions clashing on a battlefield to settle a major international dispute. Sparta had a remarkable record success. They were until 371 in the Battle of Leuctra, they won just about every single such battle, which is striking. And there must be something to the idea of Spartan skill at arms for that to have happened.
Yeah, I remember when I was a student reading Thucydides' account of the Peloponnesian War, one of the most memorable passages for me was when the Athenians captured the Spartans from the island of Sphacteria. And it's the first time anyone had ever seen a bunch of Spartan prisoners, and they're all amazed, and they're mocking them, and it's like, you guys, we captured you. And the Spartans, they don't even reply. They just mimic the finger movements of archers, indicating, yeah, you guys used arrows. We fight like actual warriors with anyway, that's just
Thucydides said it was the most surprising thing that happened in the entire war, that the Spartans were captured. Yeah. The most surprising thing. And this was a 27-year-long war where all sorts of crazy things happened. So, it must have been astonishing for the Athenians to have actually to see these captured Spartan prisoners. That just didn't happen.
By the way, I would give anything to have some fragment of an ancient text that tells us what those captives were doing for the year that they were in Athens. Like, were they watching Athenian plays? What did they think of them? Were they, meeting with Socrates on the street? Like, that would have been, really cool to see that clash of civilizations.
Yeah, I have no idea, and I don't know if there's any evidence at all about it. But you raise, given what you asked before, you raise the interesting possibility that interested Athenians, intellectual Athenians, they might have taken advantage to chat with these Spartans and learn about the Spartan order. And
Okay, so we've gone over the main traditional explanations for Spartan power, the magic constitution and the prowess in the battlefield. Clearly, you think that those fall short of offering a satisfactory explanation. So tell us what is lacking there and what's your addition to the field in your upcoming book.
Right. So I think there's something to both of those. And in particular, the idea that the Spartans in general, in a hoplite phalanx, fought better than other Greeks is very well attested in the sources. Aristotle says this just because they trained and the rest of the Greeks didn't train. And there are various other explanations by those. But there's consensus that the Spartan troops were better than the others. But what I add to the mix is Spartan success early on and a building legend about Spartan prowess in arms and Spartan courage in battle. In particular, events of the Persian Wars, the heroism of the Spartans fighting to the last man at Thermopylae, and then the success of the Spartan phalanx at the Battle of Plataea that finally defeated the Persian invasion of Greece. That this contributed to a growing mystique of the Spartans under arms, and the mystique itself made it easier for the Spartans to keep winning. Where I differ from some of the scholars and sort of popular historians you referred to in passing before, is this mystique, this legend of Spartans wasn't based on nothing. I think the sources are quite clear. It was based on something. The Spartans were, on average, better at hoplite phalanx fighting when you have a sort of particularly a large hoplite battle. But my contention is their early success and their continuing success, their ongoing success, made it easier for them to win battles and then to convert victories in battles to power in Greece overall. And I'll just give you one quick example of this. There are three major hoplite battles of sort of Greek city-states clashing with thousands of soldiers on both sides, in which one side runs away from a portion of the enemy battle line before the battle even really begins. They just throw down their arms as if they know they're going to lose, so they're going to get an advantage by running away and not getting killed. All three of those battles happen against Spartan hoplites, and this never happens with other hoplite phalanxes. So the
Wow.
Spartans were able to convert their reputation for invincibility, you said, certainly courage and skill under arms, to actually win battles more easily. And then that's part of what my book argues. Other scholars have mentioned this possibility before. But then the rest of my book goes on to explain how this reputation helped the Spartans project power in Greece for the century and a half that they were the preeminent or one of the two preeminent powers in Greece.
That is so fascinating because we don't think of the Spartans as PR geniuses, but it sounds like they were. And I wonder how much of that was crafted and how much of it just happened organically, because
Right.
a lot of the best propaganda for Sparta was written by foreigners, like Herodotus. Great propaganda. I mean, for Sparta and Athens, to be fair, but, praises the Spartans to the moon. Not a Spartan. Simonides, who writes the famous epitaph of the fallen heroes of Sparta at Thermopylae, not a Spartan. I guess, yeah. Where is this legend being fueled from over the centuries?
So I think the main thing is I mean, one of the challenges in doing the research for this book is, as you say, I mean, the Spartans aren't famous for their PR. In fact, they're famously laconic, right? They didn't say a lot. But their victories on the battlefield, particularly these large battles with thousands of hoplites on the north side, multiple city-states involved, they all would have witnessed what happened repeatedly, year after year, decade after decade, the Spartans always winning. There wouldn't have been needed an element of Spartans bragging at, Panhellenic celebrations like, Olympia, Olympics, or, Nemean Games, or there wouldn't need to be a lot of Spartan braggadocio for this reputation to settle in the minds of the other Greek city-states. Now, that said, it's a very interesting question. It's one of the questions I explore in the book. How intentional was this? Were the Spartans doing things to try to burnish the image that I think was probably growing organically? And the answer is probably yes. We don't have good sources for, a secret Spartan grand plan to make themselves be seen as invincible everywhere. But there are hints here and there. The Spartans talk about themselves as having the best reputation among the Greeks. Herodotus imputes to Leonidas, when he makes the heroic decision to perish himself with his 300 men fighting to the last against the Persians in a hopeless battle, Herodotus imputes to Leonidas the idea that he was doing this to store up a fame for the Spartans and the Spartans alone that would endure forever. So, of course, Herodotus couldn't have interviewed Leonidas at this moment. He's projecting this on him. But there's scattered testimony that suggests the Spartans were aware of the effect of their reputation and were happy to see it happen. There's one example let me give that suggests to me maybe they did. When the Spartans lost, and they did lose battles, this did happen periodically. On a number of occasions, they did what they could to avoid being seen after the defeat. And you could say this was just pride. They don't want to be, the shame of being seen in defeat, but it also could have been tactical. That is, the Spartans were used to their arms being looked at in fear. And if they've just been defeated in battle, it's not good if you're going to sort of try to burnish this invincible reputation to be seen after defeat. So after a particularly humiliating defeat during the Corinthian War, the Spartan king Agesilaus moved his army away and marched past cities at night so the other Greeks wouldn't see the defeated Spartan army marching by. So I don't know. I think there are hints to suggest that the Spartans certainly were conscious of their reputation and maybe did what they could to promote it. But we can't say.
So the other side of this coin, of this legend coin, is that you harness that reputation, that mystique, to wield and project power. And the Spartans did this by creating a league of many, many city-states under their aegis. So give us a sense of how that worked and how the Spartans were able to not only dominate over other polis, but use them as arms of their own power.
Right. So the key here isn't so much the assembling of the allies in the first place, as we talked about before, the exact time of the creation of the Peloponnesian League and how it was that Sparta in the course of the 6th century became leader of this league is not well told in our sources, but we know that by the late 6th century, the Spartans were the head of this league. One of the key contentions of my book is that the Spartan military reputation, the reputation for almost always winning, will have acted as a glue to keep its allies allied to them and to make them loath to fight against the Spartans. Because if the Spartans are invincible and you're another city-state, you want to make sure you're fighting on the same side of the battlefield as the Spartans, and you don't want to be on the other side because we know what's going to happen. You're going to lose in a major hoplite clash. And so there are some various examples in texts that I can point to about the Spartan alliance. But a key thing here is there's been work by modern security studies people and political science specialists about reputation acquisition among states, how states gain their reputation and what effects this reputation can have. And among the studies I looked at, it's quite clear that other states, when pondering things like going to war or not, pay careful attention to the military capabilities of the opposition, and not just in a sense of resources, how many soldiers they have and that sort of thing, but how well they have fought in past conflicts. This is often a key factor in determining whether other states will go to war or will stay allied with a city-state. And so you see how this plays perfectly into my thesis, that the Spartans, once they gain this reputation for invincibility in battle, which, as we've covered, wasn't based on nothing. The Spartans were good fighters, but they were able to parlay that reputation into allies who were eager to be on the Spartan side as opposed to the other side, and also enemies who were loath to launch attacks on Sparta. Curious fact of the late Archaic and Classical period down to 371 BC, Sparta is never invaded by an outside city-state going to war with Sparta. All the wars that the Spartans are involved in, and there are many, take place elsewhere. The Spartans are always taking the fight to the Argives or the Thebans or the Athenians. Never is the land of Laconia invaded by an outside force. I mean, there are raids. I'm not talking about naval raids by the Athenians in the course of the Peloponnesian War, for example. That sort of thing happens, but no army of invasion, grand army invasion. This is an enormous advantage. If you have parlayed your reputation to the point where you have the largest, most fearsome coalition of allies who like to fight alongside you because they want to be on the winning side, who is going to declare war against that or want to invade Sparta? So that's the argument that I make in the book.
And the fact that they were never invaded during that time is all the more impressive when you consider that, and tell me if I'm wrong here, but as far as I remember, the Spartans did not have like a unified wall around their settlements the way that Athens did, right?
You're correct. Sparta was an unwalled town, which was very unusual among large communities in Greece. There were some natural defensive advantages. There was the Eurotas River and there was a hill, but it was an unwalled city until much later in Spartan history than the period that I cover. So yeah, it is remarkable. It's not like, I mean, one of the things about ancient Greek land warfare is the Greeks weren't particularly good at siege warfare. Normally, to win a siege battle, the plan was just to starve out the foe. You
Yeah.
you sort of surround their city state and you just try to starve them into submission, because assaulting the walls, was very difficult and had a low success rate. Well, the Spartans didn't even have those walls. So if you could invade Sparta with an army that you thought could hold the battlefield, could win in a straight up battle, well, Sparta would be there for the taking. But obviously, no one thought that they would be able to defeat the Spartans in a straight up hoplite battle. And so that's one of the reasons no one invades. It's just a massive advantage.
Even Philip didn't dare invade. The famous if story
Tell me.
when I think it's in Plutarch. Philip's emissaries arrive in Sparta and they say, if we invade your country, we will burn your fields, demolish your buildings, rape your women, enslave all yada yada yada. And the Spartans reply, if.
Right.
Yeah.
I have another one.
Yeah.
There are a couple different versions of this told, where it's usually I think it's the Argives who say to the Spartans trying to score a point with them, there are many Spartans buried in our lands. And the Spartan reply is, yeah, but there are no Argives buried in Spartan lands.
You didn't even make it that far. Yeah.
That's right.
Another anecdote, because again, we have, I just want to stress to our listeners how scant the information is. And somebody like you writing this book, you have to look at thousands of tiny little references and fragments and, extrapolate from that. Another anecdote I remember from reading Xenophon's expedition of the 10,000, sometimes called the Anabasis. He's with these 10,000 Greek mercenaries and they're stranded somewhere like way up in Thrace, which is now Bulgaria. And it seems like in every town they go, there's a local warlord and there's one or two Spartans, like ambassadors, who are dictating to the warlord what he can or can't do. And this is right after the Peloponnesian War, so the Spartans are the supreme power in Greece. And it suggests a very impressive network of skilled diplomats that they can be spread so thin with such few people on the ground and still kind of call the shots.
Yeah. So to that point, one of the things I talk about in the book is the fact that, unlike any other city-state that we can read about in our sources, there were occasions where the Spartans would send out a general without a Spartan army, and that general would be given command of the local soldiers. Not by, and this is totally, not the normal course. What normally happens is if the Spartans are going to help the Syracusans or the Mytileneans, the Syracusans and Mytileneans in charge, the Spartans, are there to assist. But in a few cases, the Spartans go out and they're given command, not because the Spartans were the head of the alliance and there's a Spartan force. There are no Spartan troops there. There's just a Spartan general. And yet they are given command. The most famous example is Gylippus going to Syracuse in the course of the Peloponnesian War, taking command of Syracusan forces and successfully defeating the Athenian expedition and siege against Syracuse. But there are a few other cases of this, and it's curious. And I interpret this to mean this is part of the Spartan warrior reputation. The idea that the Spartans were better fighters than the others. A Spartan officer is going to be trained in tactics and warfare in a way that other Greek leaders wouldn't be expected to do, and so we'll benefit if we turn over command of our forces to this Spartan expert.
Well, that's a great segue to my next question, which is probably the million-dollar question of this interview, one that's been debated for thousands of years and will be debated as long as humans have historical records. Why did Athens lose to Sparta in the Peloponnesian War, given that, as Josh Ober points out in his recent book, The Rise and Fall of Classical Greece, the Athenian League had over 2 million people, while the Spartan League had a little over 1 million people. The Athenian League was economically way more wealthy and vibrant and developing than the Spartan League. Thucydides famously says at the end of the Peloponnesian War, he says, Sparta was the best enemy that Athens could have hoped for, because Athens was quick and enterprising and wealthy and inventive, and Sparta was sluggish and slow and conservative, blah, blah. And yet, Sparta wins, Athens loses.
Yeah.
Why?
So, yeah. Let me underscore your preface. I think most commentators going back to Thucydides' day would say the main reason is the Athenians screwed up. The Athenians messed up. The Sicilian expedition is the great catastrophe, but there are other, mistakes made by the Athenian demos, killing all the generals after the Battle of Arginusae. I mean, you make a list of mistakes that the Athenians made, but I don't think that's the main reason. It's part of it. A big thing like Peloponnesian War, it's complicated. There can be multiple solutions, but I will advance two other reasons that are equally important, I think, to why the Athenians lost. And one is the Persians. The Spartans cut a deal with the Persians after the disaster of the Sicilian expedition, such that the Persians would fund the Spartan war effort, so that the Spartans, for the first time in the entire war, could regularly contend with the Athenians navally at sea. It's a very expensive way to conduct warfare in the ancient world, to put 100 triremes in the water and pay all the crews and train them and fight naval battles. The Athenians were dominant in this in part because they were rich and they were able to, maintain a large fleet for years and years. The Spartans weren't able to do this at the beginning of the war, but once they cut a deal with the Persians, the Spartans were able to build and maintain fleets, and indeed multiple fleets. As the Athenians kept defeating the Spartan fleet in battle, the Spartans would have to keep rebuilding it using Persian money. And then the other factor, though, I want to mention is eventually, it took them a while, the Spartans produced a military genius who could take the resources that the Persians furnished the Spartans and the Peloponnesians and actually defeat the Athenians with those resources. And this is Lysander, the Spartan commander Lysander, who won some minor battles against the Athenians, but the key was his victory at the Battle of Aegospotami in 405 BC, in which a much larger Athenian fleet was surprised by Lysander and completely wiped out. And the Athenians, unlike the Spartans, were at the end of their financial rope. And this battle meant that the Spartans were able to actually besiege Athens, cut it off by land and sea, starve it into submission, and finally win the war. So I will give the Spartans more credit than most people do. I'll point to the genius of Lysander, and in a more general way, the willingness of the Spartans to arguably betray their fellow Greeks, the principles of Greek freedom, and cut a deal with the great enemy, the Persians. This was not a popular decision, surely, in Greece, except for those folks who desperately wanted to see the Athenians defeated, like the Spartans. But it enabled the Spartans to gain the resources to win the war. What do you think, Jack?
I find both of those additional explanations compelling, and they open up further questions for me because, well, it's always been a puzzle to me why Sparta won that war. And another puzzle that is kind of highlighted by your points is why Sparta declined so quickly after their victory. Aristotle has this famous line that I've mentioned on at least 2 previous episodes where he said that, in fighting, the Spartans prevailed, but in ruling, they perished. That they knew how to fight, but they didn't know how to rule. And on the one hand, I don't think that's quite correct because they knew how to rule for almost 200 years up until that point. They weren't just fighting. They did enjoy periods of almost unchallenged supremacy in the past, and that hadn't spelled the demise of their system, whereas their victory in the Peloponnesian War did seem to anticipate a quick demise. So if the Spartans have this mystique and they're able to produce the occasional genius like Lysander, and they're able to access foreign investments from the Persians and elsewhere, why do we see that quick decline in the decades following the Peloponnesian War, following their victory?
So I think the first thing to point out is that they didn't actually decline immediately after their victory in the Peloponnesian War. I think the Spartans were at their period of greatest power and influence in the years after the Peloponnesian War. For a time, they added a naval empire to their hegemony, let's call it, in mainland Greece. They fought the Corinthian War against a coalition of major Greek city-states and fought them all to a draw. Sparta was doing very well for decades following the Peloponnesian War. All this while, though, they had a growing problem that's becoming more and more obvious in reports from our sources. And that is a declining population of Spartiates, that is, full Spartan citizens. We know that the number of Spartiates was declining rapidly from something like 8,000 of them in the era of the Persian Wars to something like 1,000 or 1,500 in the 370s. And this problem is becoming increasingly acute, one imagines, and yet based on victories in wars and alliances that they're agreeing in peace treaties they're negotiating, the Spartans are at peak influence at this very time. And I think the explanation is, a big part of the explanation is this ongoing reputation. One of the battles that I pointed out where the foes just run away from the Spartans before the battle even really begins happens in this period in the course of the Corinthian War. We know many occasions where the Spartans are maintaining garrisons in other city-states. They're projecting their power. But what happens to change this, I argue, is in 371, the Spartans have managed to diplomatically isolate the Thebans and the Boeotians, so they won't have any other allies, and they invade Boeotia one more time. The Greeks expected the Spartans to defeat the Thebans once and for all, but what happened instead was the Battle of Leuctra in 371, where the Theban commander Epaminondas, leading the forces of Thebes and some Boeotian allies, fighting against a much larger Spartan coalition, manages to flip the script and crush not just the Spartan side in battle, crush the Spartan part of the battle line in the course of that clash, and humiliating the Spartans in the process. And this causes a collapse in the Spartan reputation, a collapse in the Spartan mystique. A year later, when Epaminondas decides to invade Sparta, we've talked about how unique an occasion this is. Sparta had lost most of its Peloponnesian League allies. Most of its allies had stayed neutral or joined the Thebans and joined in an invasion. And so I think that the ongoing Spartan reputation, which must have been at a peak after defeating the great Athenian Empire, helped the Spartans maintain their power even as their resources, in population at least, were shrinking after the end of the Peloponnesian War until the sudden humiliation of Leuctra.
Do you have a sense of why the population of Spartiates was declining?
There have been a number of studies on this. It's a combination of things. The two things that were probably most important, though, is that the Spartans suffered an earthquake in the middle of the 5th century BC. It was devastating. One source says Sparta lost 20,000 people. Must be talking about not more than just, there weren't 20,000 male Spartan citizens, so it must have been talking about Spartiates and Helots and Perioikoi, but huge loss of life. That plus the fact that they were in near constant warfare in the period of this time. It's just that must have drained population. And then, you can add to that the nature of Spartan society. Let's throw a bone to the ancient constitutionalists as constitution being crucial for charting a state's course through history. The Spartan constitution, among its other features, was rather isolationist. The Spartans were very protective of their citizen body. They were loath to ever add citizens from the outside to their citizen body. The training regimen for Spartans was very harsh. It was very possible as a young Spartan worked his way up through the educational system and joined the army, even before he got the chance to fight a battle and die, there are many opportunities to fall out of favor, to show cowardice, to fail to economically contribute to the Spartan polity. There are lots of ways for the Spartans to lose citizens internally, and there weren't lots of ways for the Spartans to gain citizens. So you pair that with the devastating earthquake, the constant warfare. I think it's not really that surprising that Spartan population was in decline.
To get back to the main thesis of your book, the Mystique, the example of Leuctra, the way you portrayed it was striking, because you said that the Thebans, which I didn't actually realize, were a much smaller force than the Spartan and all their allies, but they focused everything just on the Spartan contingent, that fraction of the army. It's almost as if they popped the Mystique balloon and everything else just sunk. So is the moral of the story that if you build a superpower based on Mystique, it just takes one fiasco to sink the ship irreparably?
In the Spartan case, it was actually two fiascos. The other one that I didn't talk about, but you referenced earlier in our discussion, was the humiliation on the island of Sphacteria, where the Spartans, it was a small force of Spartans, a few hundred Spartans, and they were completely surrounded by thousands of Athenians, and they were being hit by projectiles from all sides and starved out. And so, of course, they surrendered. But it was humiliating. Thucydides makes very clear that the Spartans, after this battle, behaved differently. Sparta's allies were shaken in their alliance with the Spartans after this, and the Spartans were only able to recoup their reputation and their leadership of the Peloponnesian League several years later with their victory at the Battle of Mantinea. So the Spartans saved themselves from the bubble-popping humiliation, the potential for that at Sphacteria, but after Leuctra they couldn't. And this is where scholars have traditionally argued that the population decline really hurts the Spartans, because after the Battle of Leuctra, when their allies desert them and there are not many Spartiates left, it made it impossible for the Spartans to effectively oppose the Thebans when, with their enlarged coalition of former Spartan allies, invade Sparta. There was just no effective defense the Spartans could put up. And so there was no real coming back from that humiliation. I think it's a very interesting question about Leuctra itself, what Epaminondas was intending, Epaminondas, the Theban commander of the battle, whether he had in mind the idea of breaking the Spartan reputation or not. There was nothing in the sources about that was his plan. But if that had been his idea, the battle plan he devised was perfect for doing just that. Because unlike doing what other armies had generally done in the past, which is they command, say, the right wing of battle, which would have been the wing where the Spartans weren't usually. I mean, this varied, but usually it worked out that one side, the chief force would be on their right side, and the other coalition, the chief force would be on their right side, so they wouldn't clash. That would have been the normal thing, but instead, Epaminondas purposely put all his forces, including his specially trained forces, so-called sacred band, on the left to face the Spartans, exactly the part of the battle that generally other folks ran away from, and grind them down and barely even fight the rest of the Spartan army. And it was a very unusual plan, and it worked perfectly. And yes, it popped the bubble. It destroyed the reputation of the Spartans.
And not just within weeks or days, but within seconds, right? Like it literally had an effect on that battlefield.
Yeah. And we have some testimony about that battle and this is key to understanding, that Sparta's allies weren't actually all that disappointed to see this happen. They were sort of happy to see the Spartans defeated like this, which is striking. They're supposed to be the allies of the Spartans, but I think this lends weight to my idea that, they're not allies of the Spartans because of shared interests, shared state interests, or brotherly love, Peloponnesian brotherly love or something. They're there because they're making a calculation that it's better to be an ally of the Spartans and to actually see the Spartans finally humiliatingly crushed in a major hoplite battle must have been liberating for many of these city-states.
Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Eric Robinson, this has been a wide-ranging and eye-opening discussion. Thank you so much. Just remind our listeners, what's your book's title and when is it expected to be out?
It's Spartan Legend. It's going to be published by Cornell University Press, probably early next year, 2026.
Okay. For most of our listeners who will be in the future anyway, it's already out. So, Eric, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.